Hey, this isn't one of those cases that just popped up out of nowhere. What we're looking at is a chain of tragedies, years in the making, fueled by greed and brutality. A living nightmare, honestly. But what really makes your blood run cold isn't just the violence itself. It's that when this family desperately needed the police to step in, the people who should have acted did absolutely nothing until it was far, far too late. So how did things spiral to a point of no return? Let's get into it. Our story starts in Saga Prefecture, Japan, tucked away in the southern part of the country. And look, Saga is actually a beautiful place. It's known for pottery villages with more than 400 years of history, hot springs that locals swear will leave your skin glowing. And it's also home to Saga beef, one of the most prized varieties of Wagyu in the entire world. Tourists flock there from all over. But despite all that, Saga has always held on to a certain quiet, small-town peace. The people there live steady, grounded lives, and the Takata family, all four of them, were exactly that kind of household. The father, Takata Tama, made his living as a long-haul truck driver. It was demanding work that kept him on the road more often than not, away from home for long stretches at a time. His wife, Takata Rumi, had been by his side for 11 years. She was a stay-at-home mom who occasionally picked up part-time shifts at a local restaurant, and she poured herself into raising their two young kids. Everyone who knew Rumi described her the same way: warm, enthusiastic, deeply caring. She was the kind of mother who typed up daily schedules and rules of conduct for her children and pinned them right to the wall. She planned out every meal with their nutrition in mind, making sure the family always ate well, even on a tight budget. Life wasn't lavish, but it was good. It was theirs. Then one day in June 2019, Tama came home after another grueling stretch on the road. He walked through the door expecting to see his family, and instead found only his two young children. He asked them where their mother was. They told him she'd left the house more than half a day ago and hadn't said a word about where she was going. That immediately set off alarms in his head. He grabbed his phone and called her. It rang for a long time. When she finally picked up, her voice was calm, unsettlingly calm. And what she said didn't make Tama feel any better. Rumi told him she was staying with a friend over in Dazaifu City in Fukuoka Prefecture and that she wouldn't be coming home anytime soon. But that strange phone call? That was just the beginning. After that day, Rumi essentially vanished from her family's life. No calls home, no check-ins with the kids, nothing. She stopped showing up to her part-time job at the restaurant. The only way anyone could even get a message to her was through this friend she was supposedly staying with. And on the rare occasions when Tama did manage to get her on the phone, the conversations were always off, uncomfortable, and they always, without exception, circled back to one thing: money. Rumi kept asking the family to send funds, telling them it was to cover some loans. When Tama finally sat down and looked at their bank account, his stomach dropped. Nearly 7 million Japanese yen had disappeared. That's roughly equivalent to around 47,000 US dollars, and it hadn't been taken all at once. It had been quietly drained in scattered withdrawals, bit by bit, over the previous 4 months. At the same time, Rumi's mother was picking up on her own red flags. Her daughter, someone who had always been a careful, cautious driver, suddenly called claiming she'd been in a car accident and had damaged someone else's vehicle. She said she needed 4 million yen, about $16,000, to cover the repairs. The mother dipped into her savings and helped her daughter out, and she received a settlement agreement in return. But when she went to verify the information on the document, she discovered it was a forgery, a complete fake, and it didn't stop there. Rumi also reached out to her younger sister, asking her to somehow come up with 5.5 million yen, nearly $23,000. The sister played the call back over and over, and something kept nagging at her. There were other voices in the background, faint but there. When the mother listened, she agreed, and she noticed something else too. The way Rumi was speaking wasn't like her at all. Her word choices, her phrasing, it sounded less like Rumi talking and more like Rumi reciting what someone else was feeding her. The whole family knew something was seriously wrong. They pushed to see her in person, but Rumi had an excuse every single time. She refused to meet, no matter what. Finally, out of sheer desperation, the younger sister hired a private detective. 2 months after Rumi had walked out, the detective tracked down the apartment where she and this mystery friend had been living. The family staked out the building for several days straight, waiting at the base of the complex, and eventually, Rumi appeared, getting into a car. What they saw stopped them cold. In just 2 short months, she looked like a completely different person. Her hair had been cut into a short bob. She had gained a noticeable amount of weight. And her eyes that had always been sharp and full of life, now looked vacant, dull, like the lights had gone out behind them. When the family rushed up to her with questions, Rumi didn't say a word. She just turned to the person sitting in the passenger seat and let her handle it. That person was the friend Rumi had been living with, a woman named Misaki Yamoto, 41 years old, with boldly bleached blonde hair that had been styled to perfection and a face caked in heavy makeup. When the Takata family expressed their concerns, Misaki didn't even flinch. She was dismissive, almost contemptuous, telling them the two of them were simply close friends living together, and there was absolutely nothing to get worked up about. The family turned to Rumi, hoping she'd say something different. She didn't. Rumi confirmed everything Misaki said. She even told her own family that Misaki had been incredibly helpful to her and that she had left home completely of her own free will. Then she got in the car and drove away. With the money demands coming in faster and more aggressively, the Takata family made a decision. They were cutting off the funds, and that's when the temperature in the room changed entirely. Misaki started calling, repeatedly. She told them Rumi had borrowed money from her at sky-high interest rates and couldn't pay it back. Tama, who was sick with worry about his wife living under someone else's roof, caved a few more times and sent money, but it was never enough to satisfy the so-called debt. Then Misaki escalated. She showed up at their home with a man who introduced himself as a Yakuza boss, using his presence to intimidate and pressure the family into paying. From that point on, this man became the face of the collections, always looming, always threatening. Tama had thought about going to the police. He actually did go, several times, to the Tosu police station near his home, telling officers that he believed his wife had been brainwashed and was being coerced. Every single time, the police waved it off. Family dispute, they said, not their problem. Meanwhile, completely in contrast to the police's total indifference, the collection calls just kept coming, practically every day. So Tama started recording them, all of them. By the time he was done, he had about 3 hours of audio documentation, and he brought it to the police as evidence. You can only imagine, just from what's been publicly released, how suffocating that pressure must have felt listening back to those recordings. Tama was convinced this would finally make someone take the case seriously. But the officer on duty listened for 5 minutes, and came to the same conclusion as before. Still a family dispute, no indication that Rumi's physical safety was at risk. And then, almost unbelievably, the officer told Tama that if the family disagreed with that assessment and wanted to file a formal complaint, they would need to submit a written statement, specifying exactly which parts of the recording were threatening and what charges they believed applied. For an ordinary working-class family in a rural area, that kind of bureaucratic barrier was designed to stop them cold, and it nearly did. In total, the Takata family went to the police 11 times. Not once did it lead to an investigation. And just when the family had no idea where to turn next, they got the call that Rumi was dead. At 5:20 in the morning, on October 20th, Misaki contacted the police and reported that Rumi had stopped breathing. When an autopsy was performed, the findings were devastating. Rumi's body was covered in injuries, her legs riddled with bruises. The evidence pointed to repeated blunt force trauma. She had been beaten over and over with blunt objects. The cause of death was traumatic shock from the severe injuries to her lower body. Time of death was estimated within the previous 24 hours. When the Takata family was notified and rushed to identify her, What they found was a body so badly damaged it was almost unrecognizable as the woman they loved. The following day, police arrested Misaki on suspicion of abandoning a corpse. When investigators searched her apartment, they found a blood-stained knife. DNA testing confirmed the blood was Rumi's. That discovery deepened the case against Misaki considerably. 2 men who had been present with Misaki when she reported the death were also taken into custody. A 25-year-old man known as Anaku and a 47-year-old man named Tanaka Masanori. Both of them, during interrogation, admitted they had been acting on Misaki's instructions. As investigators dug into Misaki's background, a portrait emerged of someone who had been operating in the shadows for a long time. She claimed to come from a Yakuza family, and she had been throwing that around since junior high school, using it to keep people at arm's length and establish an air of danger around herself. After graduating high school, she got into the business of recruiting customers for hostess clubs. Then in 1999, at 21 years old, she got pregnant. She didn't change her lifestyle, didn't settle down. After the baby was born, she handed the child off to her family and disappeared. From that point on, she built herself a new operation, a predatory loan shark business in the Nakasu district of Fukuoka. She was ruthless, efficient, and completely without mercy. Word spread fast, and she earned herself a nickname that stuck, the Queen of Nakasu. As for Anaku, there were plenty of rumors about whether the two were romantically involved, but Anaku flatly denied it in interviews. Within Misaki's operation, each person had a role. When a borrower refused to pay, she deployed Tanaka Masanori, who would show up and introduce himself as a Yakuza boss to scare them into compliance. In reality, Tanaka was unemployed, but he had the look and the tone to pull it off convincingly. Misaki herself played a different role. She was the charming, psychologically sharp big sister figure, running a classic good cop, bad cop routine alongside Tanaka. She'd reel victims in under the guise of friendship and stress relief, dragging them out to hostess clubs and encouraging them to spend far beyond their means. And she'd even cover the tab up front to build trust, and then she'd come back to collect, with interest, and with a long list of invented additional charges tacked on. Her criminal record backed all of this up. In 2016, she assaulted a man and extorted the equivalent of roughly $1,500 from him. Then in 2019, she got into a dispute with a woman and forced her to make 31 separate wire transfers, totaling over $42,000 in extortion. Rumi was just one of many. Then, unexpectedly, the owner of the hostess club reached out to police on his own. He told investigators he had information that he could provide evidence of what Misaki and her crew had been doing. Misaki had been a regular at his club, and he had witnessed firsthand how she treated Rumi within those walls. But at the time, fearing what her alleged Yakuza connections might mean for him personally, he had kept his head down and pretended not to notice. Now, between his testimony and the statements provided by Anaku and Tanaka, the full picture of what had happened and how long it had been building finally started coming into focus. And here's the thing, this tragedy didn't start with Rumi. It had roots that stretched back 14 years. Back in 2005, Misaki happened to run into an old junior high school classmate while eating at an izakaya. His name was Ryota. He was working a part-time shift there at the time. For both of them, it was a genuinely warm reunion, the kind you don't expect after so many years apart. They reconnected, rebuilt the friendship. And then, about a year into that rekindled relationship, Misaki came to Ryota with a favor. She told him that a colleague of his had borrowed money from her and needed a guarantor, someone to co-sign, just as a formality. Ryota, trusting her, said yes. Then the colleague vanished, completely disappeared. And just like that, every cent of that debt was transferred onto Ryota. The initial amount wasn't enormous, around 500,000 yen, roughly $4,000, but Misaki was just getting started. She piled on excuse after excuse, invented charge after charge, and the debt ballooned into something staggering. Crushed under the financial weight of it, Ryota eventually had to take a job at a shipyard all the way out in Hiroshima, a place where his housing and meals were covered, which meant almost his entire paycheck could go straight to Misaki. And to protect his family from being dragged into the mess, he made the heartbreaking decision to cut off all contact with them. For over a decade, he worked at that shipyard. Month after month, the bulk of his wages went directly into Misaki's bank account. He kept only 10 to 30,000 yen for himself, somewhere between $80 and $250, just enough for basic personal expenses. And it went even further than that. Misaki forced Ryota to legally register Anaku as his adopted son, creating a formal family relationship she could exploit for financial gain. On top of that, if Ryota were ever to die, she stood to collect a substantial life insurance payout. The goal was simple and it was total: drain this man of everything he had, down to the very last drop. When you add it all up, Ryota transferred somewhere between 30 and 40 million yen to Misaki over the years, the equivalent of roughly $125,000 to $165,000. But even that wasn't enough for her. In 2019, Misaki set her sights on someone new, Ryota's younger sister, Takata Rumi. Misaki spun her a lie. She told Rumi that her brother had borrowed a large sum of money from her and then disappeared, and that Rumi was now responsible for paying it back. Rumi had no way to reach Ryota to verify any of it. She had no idea he had been under Misaki's thumb for years. So she believed her, and just like that, she stepped straight into the abyss. From that point on, Misaki took complete control of Rumi's life. She forced her to live apart from her husband and children, cutting her off from the family she loved more than anything. She brought Rumi to adult entertainment venues that catered specifically to women with larger body types, and then she made sure Rumi became one of them. Misaki put her on what could only be described as a forced weight gain program. She fed her nothing but high-calorie food and forbade her from bathing, leaving her looking unkempt and disheveled at all times. She also made Rumi perform humiliating and bizarre acts in public, things like lunging at hosts and grabbing them uninvited, specifically designed to make people around her recoil and want nothing to do with her. The physical and psychological toll was relentless. Rumi's health began to deteriorate steadily. She started snoring in her sleep, experiencing episodes of lost consciousness, and showing signs that her body was simply breaking down under the abuse. And through all of it, Misaki mocked her openly, talking about Rumi to friends using degrading, insulting language, making absolutely no effort to hide her contempt. The Hostess Club owner later told investigators that Misaki first brought Rumi into the club about 6 months before everything came to a head. Back then, Rumi had clearly never been in a place like that before. She was awkward, wore barely any makeup, kept her distance from the hosts, and didn't even know how to drink. But Misaki kept bringing her back, once a week, every week, right up until the very end. Each visit ran somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 yen, roughly $800 to $1,200 a night. And as those visits piled up week after week, something about Rumi kept shifting. Her makeup got heavier, stranger. She looked less and less like herself. Meanwhile, Misaki had forged debt documents in Rumi's name, inflating the supposed amount owed to 60 million yen, nearly $250,000. She worked both angles at once, pressuring Rumi to squeeze money out of her family while simultaneously calling the Takata family directly to demand payment herself. But once the family caught on that something was deeply wrong and started pushing back, the money stopped flowing as reliably as it had before. And Misaki took every bit of that frustration out on Rumi. On September 25th, inside the Hostess Club, Misaki grabbed Rumi by the hair and attacked her. Anaku, who was standing right there, picked up a disposable chopstick that had been held over a flame and jabbed it into Rumi's leg. This went on for 40 minutes. Then, on October 14th, Rumi was forced to drink heavily, and her throat was burning so badly that when she spotted some ice cubes nearby, she instinctively grabbed them and shoved them into her mouth. Misaki saw it and decided Rumi was being defiant, so she and Anaku attacked her again. At one point, one of the hosts, unable to just stand by, quietly pulled Rumi aside when Misaki wasn't looking and urged her to call the police. Rumi's response was to break down in tears. She said she was too scared to run. And while Anaku would later claim in his testimony that he was just following orders, that he had no real choice in any of it, people who were actually there told a very different story. Anaku wasn't reluctant, he was enthusiastic. He sent messages to Misaki's own son, bragging about the attacks with what could only be described as glee. And Misaki's son didn't express shock or disgust. He asked for more details. He offered suggestions. It was the kind of thing that left everyone who heard about it genuinely at a loss for words. At 3 a.m. in the morning on October 20th, after what had been a prolonged and brutal assault, Rumi stopped breathing. Anaku found her and immediately got word to Misaki, who at that moment was at the hostess club, gambling. He loaded Rumi's body into a car and drove it to the club. When Misaki got the news, she didn't panic, she didn't break down, she was annoyed. And without missing a beat, she told the hostess club owner to come outside and deal with it. The owner felt he had no choice but to comply, but he also wasn't about to go down with them. Before he stepped out, he quietly hit record on his phone and let it run for everything that followed. That recording would later become one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the entire trial. There were 5 people in that car: Misaki, Anaku, Tanaka, the hostess club owner, and Rumi's body. The owner played dumb, looking at the injuries covering Rumi and asking how they got there. Anaku spoke up immediately and admitted he was responsible. Tanaka floated the idea of rushing her to a hospital, but when he checked for any sign of breath and found none, he dropped that idea and instead suggested they find a way to dispose of the body. As for Misaki, her biggest frustration in that moment wasn't that a woman had just died. It was that she hadn't gotten around to taking out a life insurance policy on her yet. After going back and forth, the group ultimately decided their best move was to call the police themselves. They drove to a parking lot outside a nearby internet cafe, made the call, and waited. And that's where they were arrested. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered something that made the whole case even darker. Before Rumi, there had been another victim. Police found that Anaku had previously been married to a woman named Sakai Minako. In 2017, not long after their wedding, she died under circumstances that at the time seemed mysterious but were ultimately attributed to natural causes. Now, with fresh eyes on the case, investigators pieced together what had likely happened. Misaki had run the same playbook on Sakai that she would later run on Rumi, forcing her to quit her job, cutting her off from the outside world, and confining her to the apartment she shared with Anaku. Sakai's permitted living space was roughly half a tatami mat. Misaki forced her to eat 2 to 3 kilograms of high-calorie food every single day. The physical strain was catastrophic. Sakai vomited constantly and developed a cascade of obesity-related health problems that her body couldn't survive. She died of acute heart failure. Because there were no visible external injuries, her death was ruled a sudden illness. Nobody looked twice. No investigation was ever opened. When all of this became public, it sent shockwaves through the community. Misaki's own mother agreed to be interviewed, and she said she still couldn't bring herself to fully believe what her daughter had done. In her experience, her daughter wasn't entirely without warmth. She always remembered birthdays, always sent flowers and notes to family members. But the mother made it clear she wasn't there to defend her. Once she learned the truth, she told her daughter directly, "Even if you come home, the door will not open for you." Then there was Misaki's son, the one who had been exchanging those messages with Anaku about the attacks. The chat logs made it pretty clear he hadn't exactly grown up to be someone you'd hold up as an example. A lot of people, hearing about him, could only shake their heads. But the outrage surrounding this case wasn't directed only at Misaki and her accomplices. The police investigation itself came under a level of scrutiny and criticism that was just as fierce, maybe more so. A Japanese television network, after learning about everything the Takata family had been through, produced a full-length documentary. It pulled back the curtain on details the police had either missed entirely or actively buried. The documentary was recognized for its significance and went on to win a major award in 2021. Through their reporting, the station revealed that 9 months after Rumi's death, in July of 2020, police finally sat down with the Takata family. An officer, speaking on behalf of the department, acknowledged that their response had fallen short and offered an apology. It seemed, for a moment, like the institution was willing to own what had happened. But then, just 5 months later, when the Saga Prefectural Police Department presented the findings of their internal review to the Prefectural Assembly, everything they had said to the family was walked back. The department head stood up and declared that based on what the Takata family had reported and the evidence they had provided, it was not possible to determine that Rumi had been in genuine, life-threatening danger. Therefore, he said, the way police had handled the situation at the time was fully compliant with regulations. That statement lit a fire. Because when the police consultation records were eventually made public, what they showed was damning. The Takata family had gone in again and again, spelling out clearly that Rumi was being brainwashed, that she was in danger, that they needed someone to actually investigate. But the records the police had officially filed told a completely different story. In the section marked Reception Results, officers had written that the family had no intention of filing a report and were essentially doing nothing, and the case had been marked resolved. It was a falsification, plain and simple. When the department head was confronted with all of this, he deflected. He talked about the importance of learning from the experience and refused to give direct answers to any of the hard questions. Then, as cameras followed him out of the room, the man who had previously made public promises about expanding support for crime victims and their families said nothing, just walked briskly to his car and drove away. The television station tracked down the officer who had personally apologized to the Takata family back in July 2020. What they found was someone who had completely reversed course. He told them the truth is not just one and refused to engage with any further questions. In January 2021, the Takata family formally submitted a request for reinvestigation to the Saga Prefectural Public Safety Commission, the oversight body that exists specifically for situations like this. The commission reviewed it and concluded that the original investigation had no flaws. Request denied. Then, in May 2021, the head of the Saga Prefectural Police Department abruptly resigned, citing health reasons. The timing raised a lot of eyebrows. When reporters asked the newly appointed department head for his take on the matter, he said he wasn't familiar enough with the details to comment. And just like that, the door was closed. Rumi's mother was furious, and she had every right to be. She said her family wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. Her words were direct and heartbreaking. We came to the police because we trusted them. This work carries responsibility for human lives. I just hope they can take that seriously. And in a genuinely striking turn, even one of the perpetrators weighed in. Tanaka told investigators that if police had stepped in and arrested him in Misaki when the extortion was already happening, none of this would have gone where it did. He called their inaction negligent. He said the police were complicit, and honestly, it was hard to argue with him. In February 2021, the case went to trial at the Fukuoka District Court. Misaki and Anaku faced charges of assault causing death, unlawful confinement, extortion, abandonment of a body, and several additional offenses. Tanaka was charged with attempted extortion, abandonment of a body, and related counts. When Misaki walked into that courtroom, she was wearing a bright red jacket, her hair freshly dyed black. She scanned the room periodically, and when her gaze landed on someone, it had a cold, cutting quality to it that people in attendance said was genuinely unsettling. Anaku, by contrast, came in with a shaved head, glasses, and a plain black and white jacket. He looked subdued, quiet, like he was trying to disappear into the background. The defense put forward the argument that Misaki had only pulled Rumi's hair, that she had not been responsible for the catastrophic injuries to Rumi's lower body that ultimately killed her. And as for the blood-stained knife found inside Misaki's apartment, her attorney offered an explanation that was almost hard to believe. Misaki had accidentally dropped it onto Rumi, causing unintentional wounds. That argument didn't last long. The recording the hostess club owner had made the night the body was transported, the one he had quietly captured on his phone, was entered into evidence. On it, you could hear Misaki herself stating that she had used a knife to attack Rumi. Enaku, also audible on the recording, voluntarily confirmed his own role in the attacks. Then came the question of who had actually delivered the fatal blows, and that's where things got explosive. Enaku went first. His answer was blunt. It was Misaki, obviously. Misaki fired back without hesitation, describing in detail how she had watched Anaku stomp on Rumi, beat her with a wooden sword, striking her at least 20 times. And then, in what the courtroom clearly was not expecting, Misaki's voice cracked. She started crying. Through the tears, she said she deeply regretted that she hadn't been able to stop Anaku, and that she was truly sorry. Enaku stared at her for a moment, visibly thrown off. Then his expression shifted into something like disgust, and he shot back loud enough for the whole room to hear. "I wish Misaki would stop this cheap act." Despite the finger panning and the theatrics, there was no disputing what Rumi had endured. A video recorded 2 days before her death was played in court, showing Misaki and her associates attacking her. The footage was described by those present as incredibly cruel, difficult to watch. Faced with it directly, Misaki chose denial. She claimed she had been drunk and couldn't remember any of it. She insisted she had simply been inviting people out to hostess clubs and had never intended to threaten anyone. Anaku, meanwhile, tried to reframe those boastful messages he'd sent to Misaki's son about the attacks, claiming that what he had actually meant to communicate was that Misaki's son should go to the police. Nobody in that courtroom appeared to buy it. Then Ryota took the stand, Rumi's brother, the man who had spent over a decade as Misaki's financial prisoner without his own family even knowing. He told the court he was still afraid of her, even now, even in a courtroom with a judge present. A privacy screen had to be set up at the witness stand so he couldn't see the defendants before he could speak at all. He disclosed something that weighed on him enormously. Just 2 days before Rumi died, he had called her. He had no idea how bad things had gotten. When she mentioned she had upset Misaki somehow, he had actually told her to try harder to stay on her good side. He had no idea those would be among the last words he'd say to his sister while she was alive. He testified about the things he had witnessed Misaki do to other victims over the years, spraying burning aerosol directly at people, forcing victims' heads toward moving vehicles, using a fake knife against people's arms to terrorize them. As Ryota described all of it from behind that screen, Misaki's composure visibly cracked. She grew restless, agitated. It was one of the few moments in the entire trial where her mask slipped even slightly. The atmosphere in that courtroom never once lifted. It sat heavy on everyone inside from the very first day to the last. At one point during a recess, someone in the gallery simply couldn't contain it anymore. A spectator stood up and shouted "murderer" at the defendants. The outburst rippled through the room and others echoed it. Misaki and Anaku didn't react, not even a flinch. When the moment came for the verdict to be read, Anaku stood there completely still, his face blank as a wall. Misaki stood beside him, occasionally glancing his way, and at certain moments offering what looked like a smile. The court concluded that the entire series of attacks had been carried out with the deliberate purpose of controlling Rumi, and that among the 3 defendants, there was a clear hierarchy of power, with Misaki at the center. As for Anaku, the court found that the enthusiasm he had shown during the violence made it impossible to characterize him as someone who had been pressured into participation. Almost all of the charges against all 3 defendants were upheld. The one exception was the abandonment of a body charge. The court determined that because they had only moved Rumi's remains to a different location without taking any steps to actually conceal them, that specific charge could not be established. The trial ran for 1 month. In May 2021, the verdicts came down. Misaki was sentenced to 22 years in prison, and Aku received 15 years and 6 months. Both were also ordered to pay the Takata family 15 million yen in compensation, roughly $61,000. Tanaka was sentenced to 2 years, suspended for 4. The judge was direct in his remarks. He noted that Misaki had carried herself as though she were above her victims and that she had taken genuine pleasure in the violence she inflicted. Neither she nor Anaku had shown the slightest remorse. In fact, they had spent the trial blaming each other. The judge made a point of stating plainly that Rumi had been treated as a slave. Her dignity had been systematically destroyed. And then her life had been taken. The suffering she endured, he said, was beyond measure. The sentence, he determined, was appropriate. When it was read aloud, Anaku didn't move. He stood there like a statue. Misaki's reaction was harder to read. She covered her face and her shoulders shook in a way that looked like it might be crying, or might be a bitter, forced laugh, or possibly both at once. In December 2021, the Fukuoka High Court reviewed the case and upheld every part of the original verdict. Neither the defense nor the prosecution chose to appeal further. Even from behind bars, Anaku kept pushing the narrative that he had been a passive participant, a victim himself in a way. In a letter he wrote to a journalist, he claimed that Misaki had treated him the same way she treated her other victims, cutting him off from his family and friends, draining him of his money, leaving him with no one and nothing to depend on but her. He said there were days he genuinely believed he was going to die, and that the only time he felt safe was when he was asleep. He described in detail how Misaki operated, how she had an almost predatory instinct for identifying what a person valued most or what they most wanted to keep hidden. She would extract that information and weaponize it, using it to pressure victims into committing new acts that became fresh leverage against them. The cycle fed itself, building walls around the victim until there was no visible way out. For Rumi, what she valued most was her family, and that's exactly what Misaki used against her. The line Misaki reportedly returned to again and again throughout those months of abuse was, "If you want to live with your family, pay the money." But the Hostess Club owner, when he sat down for his own interview, painted a picture of Anaku that looked nothing like the helpless, coerced figure Anaku described in his letter. According to the owner, Misaki had actually complained about Anaku frequently, calling him arrogant, saying he had a destructive compulsive streak, and claiming she had been looking for a way to cut him loose for a long time. That directly contradicted everything Anaku had said about being dependent on her and under her thumb. And the owner added something else that lingered. Of all the people involved in what happened to Rumi, he said Anaku was the one who frightened him the most. He described the night they sat in that car with Rumi's body, a group of people casually discussing what to do with a corpse, and Anaki sitting there eating rice balls. Calm, unbothered, making comments about the smell of a body with the same expression you'd have talking about the weather. And then, almost as a footnote to everything that had already unfolded, a figure from Misaki's past resurfaced in the most grim and unexpected way possible. On April 26, 2021, a former boyfriend of Misaki's was arrested for the murder of his 2 children. According to investigators, he had been crushed under the weight of mounting life pressures. And in what appears to have been a complete breakdown, he attacked both children with a knife and then strangled them. His original plan had been to take his own life immediately afterward, but police got to him first. A suicide note was later found that confirmed what he had confessed to. The court ultimately sentenced him to life in prison. I'll tell that story in full another time. But what's striking is this: 2 people who had once been in a relationship, who had gone their separate ways and had little contact afterward, ended up intersecting again at one of the darkest possible points. Each of them now responsible for taking lives. That kind of convergence is almost incomprehensible. In an interview, the man revealed that during the time he and Misaki were together, he had helped her extort victims and had personally taken part in attacks. He described one moment in particular that he said never left him, watching Misaki calmly use a box cutter to trim a victim's fingernails while smiling, just smiling. He said of her simply that she was not a woman. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Misaki's own story came to an end more than a year after the verdict was handed down. In August 2022, Her health took a severe turn after contracting COVID-19, and after a month of treatment, she was gone. She died in prison without completing her sentence and without, as far as anyone could tell, ever genuinely reckoning with what she had done. For the Takata family and everyone else whose lives she had shattered, her death left something unresolved and deeply painful. There's no satisfaction in it. She didn't face the full weight of her sentence. She didn't stand before the people she destroyed and actually answer for it. For the victims, did her dying in prison bring any kind of peace, or did it just add one more layer of something that can never be made right? The justice in this case was always incomplete. 11 reports to the police that went nowhere, an apology that was later retracted, records that were falsified, a system that failed Rumi at every single turn and then refused to admit it. Even the people who carried out the violence eventually condemned the police for letting it get that far. The Rumi case is a painful, lasting reminder of how defenseless ordinary people can be when greed and cruelty come for them, and of what happens when the institutions built to protect citizens either can't or won't do their jobs. In true crime, we sometimes follow cases all the way to a verdict, only to find that the verdict isn't the end of the story. There are voids left behind, wounds that don't close, and maybe the most important thing any of us can do, the only real answer to cases like this one, is to keep asking questions, to refuse to look away, to make sure that what happened to Rumi is never forgotten. That's all for today. We'll see you in the next one. Take care.